I'm Dr. Barry, licensed psychologist, and you all asked me to take a look at the Brice Rhodes case. And I saw recently that a few mental health experts testified in his sentencing because the judge took the death penalty off the table because he has a history of intellectual disabilities. And I wanted to dig deeper into that today. This is for education only. I am not able to diagnose. I'm just using publicly available information and talking about different mental health topics. Let's start with an overview of this case.
Another big story here today. Family members of a man convicted of killing 3 people in Louisville pleading with the jury today for leniency. Brice Rhodes' sentencing started today after being found guilty at about 9:30 last night on all charges. Alexis Jones and photojournalist Emma Gefter are covering the sentencing phase where witnesses took the stand.
It's been 7 years and 7 months.
Since Deborah Wren says her life changed forever.
I can't even begin to tell you how this has been. Nothing is the same. Nothing.
Wren has fought back tears every day since the trial began. Tuesday was her second time on the stand, but today she talked about the memories she shared with her grandsons Larry Ordway and Maurice Gordon.
Go to the boys' ball games, birthday parties, Christmas, everything.
But that
And they were just teenagers. They were, I believe, 15 years old.
was ripped away in 2016 when the teens were murdered, followed by 40-year-old Christopher Jones. His brother Sean Jones took the stand for the first time, speaking on behalf of loved ones.
My brother was a good man. He didn't deserve for his life to be taken. You know, for him to grow with his sons and his daughter and try to get to know or even get to know his granddaughter, he'll never have that.
While the jury convicted Brice Rhodes for the triple murders Monday, prosecutors say he has a long history of crime dating back to 2009. This includes domestic violence, armed robbery, assault, and violating parole. However, the defense stressed Rhodes shouldn't be defined by his actions.
Okay, now a lot of times people will get upset about defense attorneys in my comments, and he is just doing his job. His client does not want to be on death row. His client does not want a stiff penalty. The jury is going to give him a pretty stiff penalty. The families of the victims, of course, wanted the most severe penalty, which they did not do, but let's keep going.
Attorney Tom Griffith says Rhodes had a tough upbringing filled with abuse and trauma. Rhodes also struggles with an intellectual disability, which his stepmother spoke to.
The processing of information, the retention of information, just some cognitive things.
Unlike Rhodes' brother, who is now a college professor, Anna James says Rhodes was never evaluated. She says she wanted to get him help, but his biological mother refused.
That created friction and tension between Sean.
Based on some other testimony, it does sound like he did have some evaluations. I'm not sure if that was through the school system, but it does sound like they did get an IQ for him before the age of 18, I believe. So, but we're going to listen to that a little bit later.
And she tried to come and get Brice, and we weren't able to have the same level of contact with him that we had been before, that we were able to before.
Along with speaking on tough times, James also shared good memories, bringing Rhodes to smile for the first time.
We've always been connected. We are still connected. I love Brice forever.
The defense plans to call more witnesses to the stand Wednesday. Court proceedings will begin at 9 a.m.
All right. Because the notion of intellectual disability came up, I wanted to talk about that a little bit more. Intellectual disability in the past, in the DSM-4 and before, it was called mental retardation. We no longer use that language. The DSM-5 categorizes it as an intellectual disability. So old DSMs, like I think imbecile, like there used to be some really derogatory language in the DSM. And over the years, over time, they felt the diagnosis of intellectual disability that carried just a little bit less stigma versus mental retardation. And we have certain laws in our country where individuals who have intellectual disabilities, they cannot receive the death penalty. And that is just to take care of people that maybe their brains cognitively, they just don't work the way that everyone else does, that people that have lower IQ, lower adaptive functioning, that they would be protected. The punishment, it's not supposed to be cruel and unusual, and I believe it might have been the Supreme Court, don't get me wrong, but, like, there was a major ruling that happened that said that individuals with intellectual disabilities cannot receive that penalty. There are 3 experts that talked. One just briefly talked about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale or Study, and that includes about 10 questions that ask about a person's history of physical discipline, neglect, any parental substance use or abuse, parental mental health, divorce. There are these different questions, and the first expert is going to talk about that. The second expert is also an expert for the defense. They are going to talk about the history of psychological testing and why they feel that he does have an intellectual disability. And then the prosecution's expert is a psychiatrist from a state hospital where Brice Rhodes was for, I think they said about 2 months or so. I think he had 2 stays there of about a month each because he's had a history of a lot of court antics. He's made threatening statements against corrections officers. So he has just a history of just doing a lot. And they're going to talk about any mental health diagnoses that they saw from the correction setting. In my last video, I talked about psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, and sadist. And to me, this case, in my opinion, Brice comes off as a sociopath. That's the one that's more impulsive, that's angry and agitated, that isn't as planning and conniving and manipulative as a psychopath might be. And sociopaths, they tend to kind of rub people the wrong way. Like they might not have great social skills. He reminds me a lot of Daryl Brooks. Tell me in the comments, like let me know if anybody else kind of gets Daryl Brooks vibes from him. That is the defendant that he reminded me of the most. If Daryl Brooks had let an attorney do their job versus him trying to talk for himself. I do think that Daryl Brooks had a higher level of intelligence than Brice does, but let's hop into the testimony. Currently on the stand is Dr. James Garbario, and he is a psychologist.
As I mentioned before, there's something called the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. It's often called the ACEs for the initials ACE. And that's a way of measuring, a very important way of measuring the amount of risk factors that a kid had growing up.
So would something like the mental health issues, not only of an individual, but in their family, be a risk factor?
Yeah, as I said, what we try to do is
The answer is yes. I'm gonna
identify
fast
the
forward.
whole pattern. 2 of his biological relatives were diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a very significant problem with thinking and feeling. Again, it has some genetic basis, it's some heritability of it. If you have relatives who have schizophrenia, your risk.
But there was no evidence that Brice had any evidence of schizophrenia. Nobody, no expert talked about that.
Let's turn to the ACEs themselves. And can you, you've talked about what they are, and I'm going to use the word ACEs because I think you've explained what they are. But what I care about now, what I want to ask you about is what those actually showed with Brice. So if you could walk us through those.
Okay. Well, this ACEs is a series of 10 questions. They were developed by a physician in California who was trying to get some measure of how much adversity his patients had and how it was connected to medical problems. So he put together this list of 10 questions. There's nothing sort of magical about them. They're very straightforward. They do have a number of advantages. One is they never ask you to judge something as being abusive or neglectful. They never use that word. And that's important because if it did, it would require a person.
And that's why it's just called adverse childhood experiences. And I've changed the way, because sometimes if you ask someone, have they experienced trauma? They might say no. But then if you ask, were you ever left alone under the age of 6 for a significant period of time? They might say, oh, yeah, my parents couldn't afford daycare and we were regularly left. Not only I was left to watch my siblings as well. That would be a major adverse childhood experience that I would consider to be neglect, but that person may not have experienced it as a trauma.
Person to look at their experience and judge it against this criterion of is it abusive or not. It's very behavioral. Did this happen to you? So there's 10 questions he developed. It turned out that it's almost a miracle. These 10 questions, simply yes or no, are incredibly powerful in predicting bad outcomes. He started with health outcomes. So the score is from 0 to 10. It's simply how many yes answers did you give? And the finding was that this score predicted high blood pressure, predicted susceptibility to cancer, life expectancy. And then it got broadened still further to look at some more sort of social problems, predicting substance abuse, predicting thoughts or behavior, predicting depression, predicting violent behavior. When I say predicting, I mentioned smoking before. Smoking, quote, causes lung cancer. But smoking only accounts for about 14% of the differences in who gets lung cancer. These 10 questions account for like 50%
It was a big
of the
percentage.
differences in who ends up depressed, substance abusing, engaged in violence. So it's 3 or 4 times more powerful, the link between the ACEs and these problems, than the link between smoking and lung cancer. That's why they've been accepted by the Centers for Disease Control and they promote their use. That's why I always try to get that information when I'm working on a case, because we know that about 2/3 of Americans get a score of 0 or 1. I know when I've given this to my college students, you know, they're doing well enough in life to go to college and come to my class and so on. And, almost all of them have a score of 0 or 1. Only about 1 in 100 people get a score of 7 or more. And only 1 in 1,000 get a score of 8, 9, or 10. So it takes us from a general question, did this person have a difficult childhood, to how difficult was their childhood compared with everybody else. When I've interviewed guys who've been involved in murders, the average score is 7, which means the average guy has more adversity than 99 out of 100 people. So that's an important sort of benchmark in all of this.
And while adverse childhood experiences, it does not mean that somebody will do these things. Individuals that have these antisocial type traits that engage in these types of behaviors, they're more likely to have a lot of adverse childhood experiences.
I don't know what your scores would be, but if we filled them out, chances are, since you're functioning well enough to be here in the jury and so on, you'd probably have pretty low scores. Some of you might have higher scores, and that would be, congratulations for overcoming that adversity. Now, this individual, Brice, he again, I wasn't able to give it to him directly. I had to rely on information developed by the team who did interviews with all kinds of people, family members and others, looking at records. And the conclusion was that he had yes to 8 of the 10 questions.
Okay.
Of course, in 999 out of a.
Okay, so he has an ace of 8 out of 10. And let me pull up the adverse childhood experiences scale questions. They include physical, emotional, and essay harm. It includes neglect, both physical and emotional. It includes household dysfunction, mental illness, an incarcerated relative, a family member that was like, witnessing domestic violence, substance abuse within the home, or divorce, or growing up in a home separated from a parent. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead to the next expert. I apologize for the sound on this one. I have no way to control the volume on this. I will try when I go back and edit, I'll try to increase it some if it ends up being a little bit too low. This is the expert that's going to say that Brice has an intellectual disability.
Definition is that the problems have to be evident in the developmental period. And that's because it's a disorder beginning in childhood. That will differentiate ID from something that starts later. Like, for example, you're 30 and then you have a brain tumor, and the brain tumor destroys part of your brain, and then now your IQ is really low. That's not an intellectual disability because it didn't start in the childhood period.
I want to go back to what you were calling the second prong and just make sure that it's clear. I don't know.
So they're going to talk about his adaptive functioning and some of the issues that he had. Let me fast forward a little bit.
Somebody who's intellectually disabled.
Yes. Yes. It's interesting. A lot of folks with ID are described as quiet. And they're quiet often because they don't have a lot to say, and it's hard for them to express themselves verbally, organize their language, put their thoughts into words.
Is someone with intellectual disability more likely to communicate than with people who are their age or, in fact, younger?
Yes. There's one of the red flags of intellectual disability actually is gravitating towards younger peers and more socially immature peers, because they just literally cannot keep up. They cannot keep up with the demands that same age peers would have at all stages of development. So that's when they're kids, but also more critically during adolescence, because that's a time when peer relationships become extremely important, up until young adulthood, that sort of 22, 23. During that time period, relationships with peers, romantic relationships, etc., become really salient and important to people. And if you just don't have like the skills to keep up, then you're going to be quiet, you're going to be withdrawn, or you might gravitate to younger people.
So someone in their 20s might actually tend to socialize with people who are in their teens, for example?
Yeah, because they're at the more of the same level. The demands aren't that of a similarly aged person in their 20s, who are going to be much more subtle, more nuanced in conversation.
I personally see it as a means of control. That's what I think. That's the reason why I think Brice was hanging around younger teens, was that it was easier to control and manipulate, and that they might have looked up to him like a big brother. They might have been looking to him kind of for guidance. I don't know, that's what stands out more to me. She is gonna also talk about masking, and we'll see if we get to that part, but that often individuals with intellectual disabilities, that it's not how you see it on TV, where y how more moderate to profound intellectual disabilities are portrayed, that sometimes an individual can have an intellectual disability, and they might not appear to have that particular disability.
And it's just easier. And it's also one of the things that people do when they have intellectual disability often is try to mask those problems. And it's easier to mask those problems when you're associating with people younger, because you don't have to work as hard to try and keep up. You don't have to try to put on that face.
Now, there was something interesting to me, so I'm not sure, because it sounds like they put his diagnosis in the intellectual disability range, which I thought was typically 70 or lower, and then there's a borderline functioning range, and because some of his scores sounded like they were in the low average range, and she attributed that to the Flynn effect. Now, let's get to the cross by the prosecution.
To base his adaptive functioning on current uh, any current observations, particularly in an incarcerated setting, which doesn't approximate the real world.
So for the tests that assessed his IQ, we have 6 different test results, starting with the 2001 tests when he was 10 years old. And on that one, he had a full scale IQ of 90, which is in the average range.
So that's correct. It would need to be adjusted, however, for the Flynn effect. So the actual IQ would be more appropriately an 86.
And there's a
That's low average.
range where you can have confidence in the result of 5 points plus or minus on each of these results, isn't there?
The range depends on the particular test. In the DSM and the AAIDD, it's approximately 5, but that's because if they were to list all of the confidence intervals, which is the ranges that you're talking about for individual tests, it would be pages and pages and pages. So in the DSM and the AAIDD, they say about 5.
Okay. And for the results in the 80s, those are considered low average.
Yes.
And 70s is considered borderline.
So 70s is considered borderline according to the Wechsler, but someone with an IQ in the 70s can still be considered ID because the diagnosis of ID is in the DSM-5 and the AAIDD. The diagnosis of ID is separate from the labeling or description of an IQ according to the test. So the Wechsler test can refer.
So I personally would not I wouldn't have diagnosed someone. Now, I am not a developmental expert. I have only diagnosed ID in somebody with a IQ of 70, maybe 70, because within the low 70s, there's this range where their true score can fall into the 60s. And if we also had adaptive functioning, that's the only time. I have never given someone an ID diagnosis when they had an IQ of 90, even if the range was 80 something to maybe 95. That was very interesting to me.
To an IQ in the 70s as borderline, but an IQ in the 70s can still meet criteria for ID.
Okay.
Under the
While this plays, I'm gonna get my DSM. I have to get my DSM.
diagnostic criteria.
The second test we have results from is from 2004. And is it correct that we don't have details about this test? We just have the result that it was a full scale IQ of 80.
Again, we don't have the actual test itself, but Flynn corrected. I just want to make sure that we're looking at the right column. It actually should be a 79.
And for the rest of these, we do have more information about them, write-ups from the doctors. That test, we just simply have the result, not the write-up.
Correct, as part of a school record.
In 2007, when he was 16, there was a test by Dr. Berger. And is that one that you reviewed?
There were, I can't recall what it was that I reviewed, but it was the details of the IQ, which was a 72.
Okay.
Third.
It's 74 with Flynn effect to the 72.
It's actually it's actually a 72 if it's more correctly viewed.
Okay. And on that report, Dr. Berger said that the defendant did not appear to be motivated to perform well, did not increase his effort for more difficult tests. Therefore, the results of his intellectual and academic testing should be interpreted as cautious estimates of his actual abilities and or performance at this time. Is that correct?
That's correct. He did not indicate that it was an invalid score. He said it should be interpreted with caution.
And the 2013 test was actually taken as part of uh, his application for disability benefits, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then for the 2013 test with Dr. Riley, that one, there was great concern from Dr. Riley about the results. And he actually said the client may not have given his best effort, tended to exaggerate memory problems. Performance may reflect an attempt to present himself in a most unfavorable light in order to receive services or special considerations. The current test results are believed but a gross approximation of the cognitive and academic strengths and limitations that Mr. Rhodes brings to training and employment. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and he indicated that reevaluation in 1 year may reveal borderline or mildly impaired intellectual functioning.
He also said that the results were most likely invalid of this test, correct?
That's correct. And he said that reevaluation in 1 year would likely produce results that were in the intellectual disability range.
But he also said that even a provisional diagnosis of borderline or mentally impaired intellectual functioning was not believed warranted. On page 7.
He may have said that, yes. And again, I think it's really important because all neuropsychologists do this. We're not looking at individual scores. We're looking at them as.
Okay, so I had to go and get my DSM so that because you're looking the intellectual disability, a diagnosis of an intellectual disability, you are typically talking about an IQ that is 75 or lower. And with the Flynn effect, overly high scores due to out of date test norms. Oh, so I guess they wanted to update the test norms due to sociocultural background and native language. That is very, very interesting. I personally would not have diagnosed an intellectual disability. I might have said borderline intellectual functioning, which is different from ID. And let me see if that's still in the DSM. That's still in the DSM. I think they might have gotten rid of borderline intellectual functioning. So, because with the intellectual disability, it's still mild, moderate, severe, and profound. This is just so odd. I like the state's expert, but based on what the jury did, I think the jury believed the defense experts, or they thought there was enough there, maybe with the mitigating trauma and everything else. They went along with these.
Some of the concerns about effort, but nevertheless, there is a consistency there that his IQ scores show deficits in intelligence.
And then the final test was in 2021 with Dr. Williams, and there was also a concern about effort in that test as well, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the score that was produced, again, shows a good consistency of intellectual deficit.
Thank you, doctor. I have no further questions.
And she was saying intellectual deficit versus intellectual disability. And the defense got this on the record. And I do think this testimony ended up helping him. Ugh. I'm going to skip ahead to the prosecution's expert. So he is a psychiatrist from the jail setting, and there was a clinical psychologist at his setting that met with him as well. I don't know why they didn't have the clinical psychologist come and talk versus having the psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor that does additional training to be able to prescribe psychotropic medication. And their main practice is doing this. And he is a forensic psychiatrist. And to me, his testimony came off very credible. I think the jury saw him as being on the state side, possibly, we may never know exactly why the jury elected to reach the recommended sentence that they did. but let's see his testimony real quick.
I did. He came to our facility on two occasions, in 2019 and again in 2022. And so I saw him for about a month each time. And I saw him several times during each one of those hospitalizations.
And during those times, did he live at your facility?
Yes. So he's there again for about a month, 24 hours a day. So he lives on a unit with 11 other people. They have sort of a common area. They have their own rooms. They go to recreation. They have activities during the day, and they have a treatment team, a medical treatment team that I'm the head of, that we see him at least once a week.
Because I do believe they raised issues of his competence, so his ability to participate in his defense, his competence to stand trial. I think they raised that twice.
Week, address any psychological or medical conditions. And so we have, literally 24-hour observation of the person for a month at a time, and in his case, 2 different months.
What did you notice about his ability to interact with other people, whether staff or peers?
Well, generally, we saw Mr. Rhodes function highly. He's articulate. He could explain himself. He could communicate well. He performed what we call activities of daily living. They have to do their own laundry. You have to line up at a certain time. You have to know where to be for your meals and your meds and all those sorts of things. There's obviously some structure to it, but also we have people with low intellectual abilities that we have to assist on these things on a daily basis. They need extra help, reminders.
So this was very key to me, and I don't know. So the fact that he's able to perform his activities of daily living, because I believe the other psychologist, what she's saying is that he has limits and deficits in areas of functioning, that he wasn't able to do these things and he's not able to care for himself. And at the state hospital, they saw that he could. So
Where to be, what to do, how to function. Mr. Rhodes had none of those. He was interactive with me. He, again, could express himself very clearly. And so he was never somebody who needed special services that we ever saw as intellectually impaired in any manner. He could function fully, again, with his peers, with the staff throughout his nearly 2 months with us.
And did you or somebody on your team analyze whether he had an intellectual disability?
Yes. So we administered some psychological testing, some of which the results of you've probably heard about already. It's one of the multiple psychological test batteries he's undergone in his life. And let me flip to the right pages here. So let's see.
once again, so interesting that they're having a psychiatrist testify about the psychological testing. And I think he does this testimony a lot. He's very well versed in the testing and all of that for and yet psychiatrists and psychologists are trained very differently. So as a psychologist, it was interesting to see this. So, let's keep going.
So the testing we did was in December of 2021. So it was his second admission. And this is Dr. Williams, our head of psychology. And whenever we give psychological tests, an IQ test being sort of the most prominent one we've probably heard about today, you have to give measures of effort. Because if I give you a simple math test and I ask you what 2 plus 2 is, and you don't want to get the right answer, you can say 5, right? So it's really easy if you don't check to have somebody not give your full effort. So we have to give those measures of effort, and we did, or Dr. Williams did, and we got a full scale IQ of 73, which formally falls in the borderline range, but he gave poor effort. And we give specific measures to look for that. These are not something we've created. They're published, they're used everywhere across the country in every university. So he failed those measures of effort. So that suggests that 73 is a low estimate of his true ability.
And just to further explain what measures of effort are, so there are certain tests that are trying to see if someone is faking bad, if they are trying to look more impaired than they actually are. And they compare their scores to individuals who do have certain impairments and they don't even score as low as this individual scored. And so that's sometimes what happens on that type of test.
And so, and when we look at his, and then we compare how he's behaved for the month or two he's been with us, compared to that test, we again believe that 73 is not a true score. It's suppressed on purpose by him. Now, granted, that happens a lot. When you're in the kind of situation we're in, you expect those things to sometimes happen, because people are under a lot of pressure, all that sort of thing. But the bottom line, the important thing to realize is that 73 is an absolute minimum. And if we only know that score, we think he's better than that or higher than that, but we just don't know how high. Luckily, we have some other information to tell us.
Is it possible to fake up on an IQ test?
No, if you could fake.
Yes. And so I guess I have to say that too. So you can't do better than, so you can fake bad, but you can't fake good. Like you can't do better on an IQ test than your actual
Better
intelligence.
than your true ability, well, then everybody do it, right? So whatever, if you take an IQ test, you can only get up to your full ability. These aren't tests where you can like guess a couple questions and get a significantly higher score. There's an error of 5 points. So if your real IQ is 100, you can maybe get 105, but probably you're going to get a 99, 101, something like that. You can't fake a 120 if you're 100. And remember, 100 is average. That's the average of all of us, the whole country. So, so generally, your highest score, if you've taken it a bunch of times, is closest to your real score.
Did you look into whether the defendant was suffering from any mental illnesses?
Yes. So that's something we are concerned with all the time. And we treat people with mental illness constantly. I'd say about 80% or 85% of the people we treat, we treat for a mental illness with some medication and therapy and other things. We even treat people who don't want to be treated because we see the illness, but they don't admit it. So that's a whole process we have to go through sometimes.
And he's mentioning court ordering people to treatment that they might refuse.
In this case, Mr. Rhodes reported some anxiety, and I believe he has anxiety. I think there's some records to suggest he has anxiety. I think he's under a lot of stress and has been for several years while he's facing these charges. That's stressful. So we treated him for anxiety. At one point, I think in the first admission, we gave him an antidepressant, Celexa, for anxiety. This last time, we treated him with Vistaril, I think, which is a mild anxiety medicine. And I think he preferred to be on the medicine. It was helpful. But really, anxiety is all we saw. We didn't see any evidence of depression or mania. We didn't see evidence of psychosis, like hallucinations or delusions. These are all things we look for in every single person, whether they report it or not. We didn't really see any of those things.
All right. So the jury ended up coming back with their sentencing, and let me make sure to show you that part.
All right, so I understand that we have a verdict from the jury as to sentence. First of all, I want to thank all of you for sitting through emotional testimony without disrupting the trial. I appreciate that very much. And I sincerely hope that that continues once the jury is back in. Once you leave this courtroom, you are free to have whatever reaction you would like to have. But while in the courtroom, I ask that you not have any reaction to whatever the verdict may be. We're ready. Thank you.
This is just my opinion. To me, he comes off very emotionally attached, cold, and callous. That's just how he comes across to me. And that could be masking anxiety. It could. Just comes off like he doesn't care.
Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mr. Foreperson, if you could please hand the verdict forms to Deputy Mills. Thank you, sir.
Sometimes people hold their hands like this is like calming. We used to use it to de-escalate people. We used to hold our hands like this in kind of a non-threatening way. I don't know if that's why he's doing it, but yeah. He does a lot with his beard
Counsel,
too.
would you all approach for just a moment?
Gonna fast forward.
All right. In the matter of Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Brice Rhodes, the jury's verdict is as follows. Count 1, murder as to Christopher Jones. We, the jury, do find beyond a reasonable doubt that an aggravating circumstance exists in this case and fix the defendant's punishment for the murder of Christopher Jones at life without the possibility of parole.
And they pretty much found that there was extenuating circumstances for all of his charges, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, or because he had some charges about like with a corpse or evidence or something. And so he ended up getting, I think, a year or something. But and that all of those will run consecutive. Yes, not concurrent. So not at the same time. They're going to run one after another. So I believe he ended up with 3 life sentences and some other stuff. And so, whew, difficult one. And so this is the first one that I've covered here on my channel about an intellectual disability. Do I think he has an intellectual disability? I wouldn't have diagnosed him with one. It does sound like there might have been a history of significant trauma because sometimes childhood experiences can be extenuating circumstances. So I don't know what all the jury considered. I do think they did life without the possibility of parole just because the family I think wanted the harshest penalty possible. The family of these victims, they definitely wanted the harshest penalty possible. If y'all have other cases that y'all would like for me to cover, especially going into the new year, I definitely will be covering Lori Vallow, Sarah Boone. I will be covering the Alexi Treviso. I will be covering a lot of those big cases. If there are any that you would like for me to cover, please let me know. I will also be doing a stream where I go over my favorite cases from 2023, including Murda. I did not cover the video from the Depp Heard trial. It was before I figured out some of my technical stuff, and I will just mention that one and a few other cases and just answer any questions that you all may have and talk about what you all can expect from this channel in the coming years. If you like this content, make sure to click that like button. It really does help. And subscribe if you're looking for more content like this. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.